"Stop resisting!" the officer barked, his voice slicing through the cool night air as his gloved hand gripped the pepper spray. Without hesitation, he unleashed a blinding stream into the eyes of the young black boy standing frozen beside the gas pumps. The boy screamed, stumbling backward, clutching the plastic bag of chips and soda that now slipped from his hand and hit the concrete with a hollow thud. His only crime was existing in the wrong place, in the wrong skin, before the wrong man. The officer stood tall, chest puffed beneath the weight of his uniform. His badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, a weapon he wore with pride, a shield he thought untouchable. This wasn't law enforcement, it was theater, and he was the star of his own cruel performance. He thrived on intimidation, his smirk widening at the sight of the boy's tears. To him, authority was measured not in justice, but in how small he could make another human being feel. The boy couldn't have been more than 14, maybe 15. A slim frame, a hoodie pulled tight against the evening chill. He didn't raise his fists, didn't argue, didn't move except to cough and gasp as his eyes burned. He reached out blindly, desperate for air, for water, for mercy that never came. And still, within that moment of agony, there was something unshakably calm about him. His dignity wasn't gone. It was buried beneath the pain, waiting. A small crowd gathered, drawn by the commotion. Some shook their heads, muttering under their breath, "Not again." A few pulled out their phones, screens glowing as they recorded every second. But others laughed nervously, as if cruelty in uniform was just another form of entertainment. The officer played to them, sneering down at the boy, mocking the way he cried, spitting out accusations like bullets. "Fits the description. Looks suspicious. Another thug off the street." The boy said nothing. He couldn't. His silence was louder than any protest, heavier than any denial. He knelt on the concrete, hoodie soaked from tears and pepper spray, and simply endured. The officer laughed, tossing a look at the cameras as if daring anyone to challenge him. To him, this was routine, another night of unchecked power, another body humiliated beneath his boots. But the crowd didn't know what he didn't know. The narrator's voice cuts in, cold and sharp. They thought it was harmless brutality, just another night of unchecked power. But within hours, the boy's silence would summon a reckoning, because the man they mocked was the son of someone their arrogance should have never crossed. The boy's story began in struggle. He lost his mother young, a wound that carved silence into his home but also deepened the bond with his father. His father became both parent and guide, working long hours but never too tired to check his son's homework, never too weary to say, "You are more than what they see." Growing up, the boy learned quickly that the world often measured him by stereotypes rather than substance. Teachers hesitated to praise his brilliance, treating his perfect scores in math as flukes rather than talent. Store clerks followed him through aisles, assuming theft before trust. Strangers clutched purses or locked car doors in his presence, though his only crime was walking home. Each incident carried sting and weight, but he found grounding in the lessons his father repeated nightly. Dignity doesn't shout. It waits, and then it roars. School became his dual arena, both battlefield and sanctuary. He loved science, the thrill of circuits lighting up, the mystery of engines coming alive, the elegance of equations solving neatly. His notebooks were messy with sketches, wild ideas, inventions waiting to breathe. In parallel, basketball gave him rhythm, release, and freedom. On the court, he wasn't a stereotype or a shadow. He was movement, strategy, and grace. College was not a dream but a destination. Every night he toggled between gadgets on the kitchen table and layups on cracked asphalt, believing both paths would lead him forward. Resilience became second nature. When peers mocked his seriousness, he smiled and kept sketching. When adults doubted him, he stayed silent and let his work answer. He was a boy carrying both the weight of injustice and the spark of possibility. On the opposite end of town lived the man who would one day assault him. He was no stranger to authority, but he wore it as armor, not responsibility. A veteran officer with years on the force, he had long stopped seeing himself as a protector. The badge on his chest was not service, it was a crown. A crown he believed gave him the right to command, to intimidate, to diminish. Inside the precinct, he was known for being tough. Colleagues praised his record of arrests, his aggressive stops, his refusal to bend. But beneath that mask of discipline festered arrogance. He thrived on fear, relished the sight of trembling hands and lowered eyes. His power was not measured in justice, but in the number of people he could break, and break them he did. Black boys became his favorite targets. In his eyes, they were not students, not children, not dreamers. They were suspects waiting to be caught. Every hoodie was a threat, every pause a signal of guilt. He spoke of law and order, but what he enforced was dominance. At home, he likely justified it all, telling himself he had kept order on the streets. But in truth, his nights were fueled by ego. His uniform wasn't just clothing. It was theater and the world his audience. He mistook intimidation for control and cruelty for respect. The contrast between these two lives could not have been sharper. One boy, raised in absence yet grounded by presence, carrying quiet dreams of invention and knowledge. One man, armored in arrogance, chasing validation through fear. One boy built resilience in silence. One man shouted to mask his own emptiness. Their collision was inevitable. The boy, hoodie drawn against the chill, carried chips and soda in his hand. The man, chest out beneath fluorescent lights, carried arrogance in him. One had silence that would roar when the moment came. The other had noise that would crumble when the instant truth arrived. The boy's father, though unseen that night, was always near in spirit. A towering figure in his son's life, he was no ordinary man. He had spent years serving the country at the highest levels of law enforcement, navigating corridors of power most could not imagine. Yet at home, he was simply Dad, the man who drilled into his son the lesson of patience, dignity, and strength. The officer who mocked, sprayed, and sneered had no idea the shadow standing quietly behind the boy. He saw only what he wanted to see, another black child to belittle, another life to use as his stage. He never stopped to consider that his cruelty might backfire. He never paused to ask whether arrogance could withstand truth. The narrator's voice settles with finality, cutting the scene like glass. What he didn't realize was that this boy was not alone. His father's shadow stretched farther than any badge could reach. The ride to the station was short, but the humiliation stretched with every second. The boy sat in the back of the cruiser, wrists bound too tightly in handcuffs that bit into his skin. The pepper spray still burned his eyes, but he kept his head lifted, blinking through the pain. He didn't cry anymore. He didn't beg. He simply endured, silent as the city lights blurred through the window. The officer in the front seat smirked, satisfied with his work. "Taught that punk a lesson," he muttered to his partner. "Kids like him need to be put in their place." The words were meant to diminish, to flatten the boy into nothing more than a stereotype. But the boy's silence was not a weakness. It was heavy. When they arrived at the station, the officer yanked him out, parading him past desks and clerks like a trophy. "Look at this one," he announced loudly, gripping the boy's arm harder than necessary. "I think he can walk around like he owns the streets." "Not on my watch." His voice was thick with arrogance, each word a performance for the room. Some officers laughed, echoing his cruelty. One slapped the officer on the back, chuckling, "Another thug off the streets, huh?" The sound carried through the room like a cheap applause, reinforcing the arrogance. But not everyone joined. A few glanced up, frowning. Their eyes lingered on the boy. His small frame, his quiet face, the way he carried himself with composure far beyond his years. Something didn't sit right. At a desk nearby, a clerk lowered her pen, studying the scene. She whispered to the colleague beside her, "Why isn't he fighting back? Why does he look so calm?" The question hung in the air, a seed of doubt in a room otherwise saturated with arrogance. The officer dragged the boy to a bench, pushing him down roughly. "Street trash," he sneered. "Think you're tough? You're nothing. Just another statistic." He pulled out a report and began writing, embellishing every detail. Resisted arrest. Threatened an officer. Fit the description of a suspect. Each false word scratched onto paper, a weapon disguised as ink. The boy sat still. His wrists ached. His eyes burned. But his gaze, steady, quiet, never wavered. He looked at the officer not with fear, not even with anger, but with a calm that unsettled more than defiance ever could. It was as if he knew something the others didn't. The officer noticed the look and scoffed. "What are you staring at? You think you're smarter than me? You think sitting there silent makes you brave? You're a nobody. You'll always be a nobody." His words grew louder, more desperate, as though trying to crush the very calm that unnerved him. Others in the station shifted uneasily. The boy's silence was beginning to change the air. Laughter sounded forced. Whispers began to rise. "He doesn't look like a thug," someone muttered. "He looks like he knows something." The officer doubled down, his voice booming. "Write this down," he said to no one in particular, slamming his pen on the desk. "This punk thought he could outsmart me, thought he could walk these streets like he owns them. But I put him in his place." He puffed his chest, feeding on his own performance. But the audience was slipping. The boy remained still, hands cuffed, back straight. Every second he stayed calm, every breath he took without breaking, made the officer's words sound hollower. It was a power shift so subtle most missed it, but those paying attention felt it in their bones. The silence carried weight. The clerk who had been watching leaned closer to her colleague. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "Careful. Sometimes the quiet ones surprise you." The colleague nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the boy as though bracing for something unseen. But the officer, too consumed by arrogance, didn't hear. He bragged louder, boasting to his peers. "Taught him a lesson tonight. He'll think twice before trying to act tough again. Just another kid who thought he mattered." He laughed at his own words, expecting the room to join. Some did, but weakly. Others stayed silent, glancing at the boy with unease. For the boy, the station was suffocating, yet he held his composure. He remembered his father's voice, steady and firm. "Dignity doesn't shout. It waits, and then it roars." Those words pulsed in his chest like armor. He didn't need to respond to the taunts. He didn't need to defend himself. His silence was enough, for now. Minutes stretched. The officer finished his report, shoving it into a file. "That's that," he declared, smirking at the boy. "Enjoy your night behind bars, kid. You'll get used to it. People like you always end up back here." He stood taller, convinced he had won, convinced the story he had written was the truth, but others in the room weren't so sure. A young officer frowned, glancing at the file. "Resisted arrest?" he murmured, reading the words aloud. "Did he really?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. A ripple moved through the room. Doubt spread. The boy sat quietly, head bowed slightly but not in defeat. His silence was deliberate, his calm intentional. He wasn't powerless. He was waiting. The station, once filled with laughter and arrogance, now carried tension thick enough to choke. The officer didn't notice. He strutted, still boasting. But every word, every false report, every sneer was only digging deeper into the trap he had unknowingly set for himself. And the boy? He simply waited. Because he knew what the officer didn't, that arrogance always collapses under truth. The following morning, the station buzzed with whispers. The officer who had pepper-sprayed the boy strutted in, smirking, convinced the incident was already behind him. He treated it as routine paperwork, another day of cleaning the streets. He adjusted his uniform in the glass door before entering the hearing room, confidence oozing with every step. To him, the world still belonged to the badge on his chest. Inside, a small crowd had gathered. Colleagues, supervisors, clerks, and curious staff. Phones rested in pockets, hands itching to record what they suspected might turn interesting. The officer chuckled as he took his seat, tossing his file on the desk with arrogance. "This won't take long," he muttered to a younger officer beside him. "Just another box to check. They don't care what happens to kids like that anyway." But the room shifted when the door opened. Silence rippled across the floor as a tall figure in a dark suit entered. His presence was magnetic, commanding respect without a word. His polished shoes echoed against the tile. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the room. The officer's smirk faltered. The presiding authority of the hearing was not the precinct captain, not a city official. It was the boy's father, an FBI official of the highest rank, a man whose decisions rippled across the nation. He carried not only power, but gravity, the kind that made arrogance shrivel in its shadow. Gasps spread. A few hands darted to phones, screens flickering as discreet recordings began. The officer blinked, trying to steady his breathing, but the color drained from his face. His heart pounded in his chest as realization hit like a hammer. The boy he had mocked, humiliated, and pepper-sprayed was the son of one of the most powerful men in federal law enforcement. The FBI father placed a folder on the desk. He didn't sit. He stood tall, every inch of him radiating authority earned, not borrowed. His voice was calm but sharp as glass. "Let's begin." The officer swallowed hard, forcing a laugh. "Sir, I think there's been some miscommunication. This was a routine arrest. Nothing unusual. The kid resisted and I—" "Stop!" The word was delivered like a gavel. The father opened the folder. From it, he pulled still frames, images taken from the gas station surveillance cameras. He held one high, the boy standing with chips in his hand moments before the attack. The silence was suffocating. "This," the father said, "is your suspect before you assaulted him." The officer shifted in his chair. He fit the description. The father laid another image on the table. The officer shoved the boy against the hood of his car. Another photo. The stream of pepper spray igniting across the boy's face. Each one more damning than the last. "And this," the father continued, voice unwavering, "is what you did to him. In your report, you wrote, 'Suspect resisted arrest.'" He flipped open the officer's handwritten statement, reading aloud each embellished lie. "You claimed he reached for your weapon. You claimed he threatened you. You claimed force was necessary." He paused, letting the room absorb the weight of the words. Then he turned to the footage, playing the video on a screen for all to see. The boy stood calmly, bag in hand. The officer lunged without cause. The spray, the mockery, the collapse. The truth was undeniable. Gasps filled the room. Phones lifted discreetly, red recording dots glowing. The officer's bravado melted. Sweat gathered on his brow. That video doesn't show everything," he stammered. "He was suspicious. The father leaned closer, voice low but cutting. "The only suspicious thing here is your report." He slammed the folder shut. The sound echoed like a verdict. Applause broke out from the gallery, first scattered, then swelling. Colleagues who once laughed now shook their heads in disgust. The officer looked around desperately, searching for support. None came. His arrogance, once his shield, had become his undoing. The FBI official fixed him with a stare so sharp it cut the air. "The badge," he said slowly, "is not your weapon. The law is." The words hit harder than any shout could. The officer tried to speak, but his voice cracked. His hands trembled. For the first time in years, he was the one powerless, the one diminished, the one seen not as authority, but as a man stripped bare by truth. And then came the final blow. The father lifted a flash drive, plugging it into the station's system. On the screen appeared clips recorded by bystanders, videos that had already begun circulating online. The slap of the officer's hand on the boy's chest, the sneer on his face as he mocked the child's tears, the laughter of cruelty echoing in the night. "This," the father declared, voice rising, "is not policing. This is abuse. This is a crime. And this," he pointed at the frozen image of the officer on screen, sneering down at a child, "is your legacy." Silence. Then a roar of applause. The gallery stood, clapping, cheering, voices rising in vindication. The officer sank in his chair, face ashen, unable to move. The power he once wielded had evaporated in seconds, replaced with the weight of disgrace. By the time the hearing ended, there was no question of his fate. His arrogance had collapsed beneath the evidence, his lies shredded by truth, his smirk drowned out by the applause of justice. And as the room emptied, one line remained etched in every mind, the father's words echoing louder than the slam of any gavel. "The badge is not your weapon. The law is." That night, across the nation, the pepper spray incident replayed endlessly online. News anchors dissected it, hashtags surged, millions shared the clip. The officer had tried to humiliate a child, but in the end, his cruelty became the evidence of his downfall. The fallout was swift. The moment the FBI official finished speaking, the disciplinary panel moved without hesitation. The officer, who had strutted in with arrogance, now sat frozen, trembling as his badge was stripped from his chest. The metallic sound of it hitting the table rang through the hearing room like a final verdict. Gasps rippled, then whispers, then silence so sharp it cut. Two internal affairs officers approached. "You're done," one said flatly. The disgraced cop tried to protest, mumbling about misunderstanding, about procedure, but his voice had lost its weight. He was escorted out in handcuffs, irony twisting like a knife. The same hands that once reached for pepper spray now hung useless at his sides. The respect he once commanded evaporated instantly. In the gallery, faces turned away from him. Colleagues who had once slapped his back in camaraderie avoided his eyes. No one rushed to defend him, no one softened his fall. The silence of abandonment was louder than any condemnation. For years he had hidden behind the badge. Now, stripped of it, he was nothing but a man defined by cruelty. For the boy, however, the tide shifted. Just hours earlier, he had been coughing in pain, tears stinging his pepper-sprayed eyes. He had been mocked, humiliated, accused of crimes he never committed. But now, the very composure that carried him through the ordeal became a symbol. His quiet dignity, his refusal to break even under assault, struck a chord with everyone who watched. As the footage spread beyond the room, across phones, across the internet, the narrative changed. No longer was he another suspect. He became the face of resilience, the boy who endured cruelty with grace. His father's authority carried weight, but it was his own calm strength that drew admiration. Civil rights leaders praised the moment as a turning point, proof that patience and dignity could dismantle even the loudest arrogance. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Yet the boy did not gloat. He stayed close to his father, head held high, letting the truth speak for him. He didn't need to shout. His silence had already roared. That night at home, the house felt different. It was the same modest space, with the same worn furniture and family photos lining the shelves, but it carried the weight of victory. The boy sat at the kitchen table, the place where he had once scribbled equations and sketched inventions. His father sat across from him, no longer the imposing FBI official, but simply Dad, tired but proud. The boy lowered his gaze. "I didn't do anything," he whispered. "I just stayed quiet." His father reached across the table, resting a hand over his son's. His voice was low, steady, filled with pride that could not be contained. "You didn't just endure," he said. "You made the truth roar louder than arrogance ever could." The boy's chest tightened. He had always believed his father's words about dignity, but tonight he understood them differently. Dignity was not weakness. Dignity was strength so deep it could overturn arrogance in its own time. Meanwhile, the officer's downfall spread like wildfire. Clips of the gas station assault, the pepper spray, the sneering mockery, all replayed endlessly online. Then came the footage from the hearing, his lies exposed line by line, his face draining of color as the FBI father dismantled him. The two images, his cruelty and his collapse, were shared side by side. His name trended for all the wrong reasons. He was no longer known for his years on the force, for his so-called toughness. He became infamous for one thing: arrogance undone. He was the cop who mocked a child, only to discover that child was untouchable, not because of wealth, not because of privilege, but because truth itself had weight. In living rooms across the country, families watched the story unfold. Parents turned to their children, pointing out the boy's composure, reminding them that strength didn't always come from shouting or fighting back. Teachers showed the clip in classrooms, using it as an example of systemic injustice unmasked. Activists lifted it as a rallying cry, proof that the fight for dignity was never in vain. The boy didn't see himself as a symbol. To him, he was just trying to survive a night of cruelty. But symbols are rarely born out of choice. They are born out of truth too powerful to ignore. And now, his truth was everywhere. The officer, meanwhile, could not escape his new legacy. Every article, every broadcast, every post tied his name to arrogance and downfall. Doors that once opened easily slammed shut. Even those who had once defended him grew silent, unwilling to be associated with his disgrace. He became a cautionary tale, proof that arrogance has no armor when truth arrives. At the end of the night, as the boy climbed into bed, his father checked on him one last time. The room was quiet, filled with the hum of the city outside. "You okay?" his father asked softly. The boy nodded. "Yeah, he whispered, pulling the blanket close. His father smiled faintly. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow the world will still be talking. But tonight, let yourself rest. You've already done enough." The boy closed his eyes, carrying with him not the sting of pepper spray, not the sound of mockery, but the weight of his father's words. For the first time in days, he slept without fear, knowing that dignity had indeed roared, and the world had listened. The boy's life did not shrink after the gas station assault. It expanded. Instead of being defined by humiliation, he became defined by what came after. He returned to school with quiet determination, notebooks still filled with sketches of machines and equations, but now also with a new sense of purpose. What he had endured was bigger than himself. It was a story that had caught fire across the country. Teachers who once underestimated him now looked at him with awe. Classmates who had seen the viral clips whispered his name in hallways, not out of mockery, but respect. He refused to let bitterness guide him. Instead, he poured himself into his studies with the same steady calm he had shown that night. Years later, he graduated with honors in engineering, but he did not stop there. He launched a foundation dedicated to helping youth targeted by profiling, blending his passion for science with activism. The foundation provided mentorship, scholarships, and even workshops where kids could learn both technology and resilience. "Justice and innovation go hand in hand," he said at the launch event, echoing his father's lessons. "We can build futures brighter than the shadows of arrogance." Meanwhile, the officer's fall was total. What he once carried as pride, his badge, his years of service, crumbled under the weight of one reckless act. He had thought the boy was powerless. Instead, his name became a curse, forever linked to arrogance undone. He was not remembered as a veteran cop, nor for any cases he might have worked. He was remembered only as the man who pepper-sprayed an FBI official's son and lost everything. Job offers vanished. His reputation dissolved. Even those who had once laughed alongside him distanced themselves, unwilling to share in the shame. He lived in the shadow of a single moment, a cautionary tale told in police academies about the dangers of unchecked power. The institution he served could not escape unscathed either. Public outrage demanded accountability. The department enacted sweeping changes. Body cameras became mandatory, stricter use-of-force policies were enforced, and community accountability boards were established to monitor officer conduct. No longer would incidents vanish into silence. The boy's ordeal had forced the system to admit its flaws, and the impact reached beyond one city. Across the country, other departments took note, citing the case as a warning and a catalyst. Lawmakers pointed to it when arguing for reform bills. Activists held it up as proof that arrogance could be dismantled, not by rage alone, but by truth, exposure, and courage. Online, the legacy roared louder still. Hashtags surged within hours of the video's release and never truly faded. Justice roared. Ichiu badge is not weapon, Wachu pepper spray backfired. Millions used them to share stories of resilience, to demand change, to celebrate the boy's dignity. His name became synonymous with strength, his silence remembered as the calm before a storm that shook a nation. For the boy, it was never about revenge. It was about making sure no one else endured what he did. In interviews, he often returned to his father's words. Dignity doesn't shout. It waits, and then it roars. Those words became the motto of his foundation, etched on its walls and echoed in every program it launched. In time, his story reached places he could never have imagined. Classrooms, boardrooms, even global stages. He spoke not as a victim, but as a builder, insisting that justice was not just punishment, but progress. The boy who had once knelt on cold concrete, blinded by pepper spray, now stood tall, commanding rooms with a voice that carried both gentleness and fire. And so the legacy solidified. A child who endured cruelty with dignity grew into a man who turned pain into power. An officer who mistook arrogance for authority became a symbol of disgrace. A system that had once ignored abuse was forced to reform, and a world weary of injustice found inspiration in a single truth. Arrogance collapses when faced with dignity. The night at the gas station was not the end of the boy's story. It was the beginning of his roar, They mocked a boy's skin, forgetting that truth needs no permission to rise. In a single night, arrogance collapsed, and dignity stood taller than the badge. The image of that gas station remains etched into memory. The sting of pepper spray, the laughter of bystanders, the hollow power of a uniform misused. But it is not cruelty that lingers strongest. It is what came after. A boy's quiet strength became a roar that echoed far beyond one city. His dignity became a mirror, reflecting the corruption of arrogance and the resilience of truth. This story is not just his. It belongs to every child who has ever been told they were less, to every family who has endured humiliation under the weight of authority. It reminds us that real power is not in the badge, nor in the weapon, but in justice itself. True power, justice. True wealth, humility. True downfall, arrogance exposed. If you believe no child should ever suffer under arrogance disguised as authority, share this story. Let the world see. Dignity will always rise, and truth will always roar.